I hope everyone had a good Saturday and it was an enjoyable, productive day perhaps. And now we can do what's really important, and that's devote ourselves to a study of God's Word and to center our minds on God and think about who God is and what our life in this world is all about. So how did we get here? We've had two previous lessons. What's been our baseline thought on which these lessons are built? So number one, we said that we're on not merely a journey through life, but a quest. We're searching for truth. We're searching for knowledge. We're searching ultimately for what is real. And so we live in a world of deception by design, not God's design, but the devil's. We live in a world of conflicting ideas. We live in a world that's very complicated, a very complex world, both in regard to the environment itself that we live in, but also in regard to the other people that we're going to deal with in life. And we can be confused about ourselves sometimes. We talked about that in a little more depth last night. And so if we're really going to understand reality, we're really going to find out the truth, we're going to have to go to God. Because He's not only the creator He is, and we've talked about that some as well, God is the designer. He knows how we function. He knows how we're comprised of spirit and flesh. He knows what our tendencies are. He knows where our weaknesses are. He knows what our failures are. And if we really want to discover ultimate reality about everything that matters, we're going to have to go to God. And we also said that very few people in the history of mankind have had opportunity to speak directly to God, and in the New Testament context, speak directly to Christ. You know, it's very common today to hear people say something like, well, if God would just show Himself to me, well, I would believe in Him. Or, you know, if Jesus would just give me a message. But, you know, you're talking about a very, very small minority of people who've had such a privilege, sometimes such a fearful experience of coming in some kind of direct contact with God, be it His voice from heaven, be it an angel that's been sent by God, or perhaps coming face to face with the Lord Himself. Not many people in history have been so privileged. The rest of us are going to have to dig. We're going to have to think. We're going to have to explore. We're going to have to exert ourselves to find God in the ways that He's revealed Himself. And He has. But we said last night, it's not like a $20 bill laying on the pavement that's so obvious. It's more like the gold buried underground or the gems that are in caves underground, and you've got to go dig and you've got to search. And in so doing, God is finding out who's really serious about a relationship with Him, who's really serious about fellowship with Him. And so what this part of our weekend is about, after we got past Thursday night, which was kind of our baseline lesson. But now we're thinking specifically about people that encountered Jesus and what they asked Him. What was important to people? And we're talking about people coming from all sort of different points of the human compass. What was asked of Jesus? So that's what these lessons are concentrating on. And let me begin the meat of the lesson here by issuing a warning, two parts. Number one, this lesson is going to be like drinking out of a fire hose. I've got a lot of things to get out in front of you and not all night to do it. So if you're taking notes, warm up your pen, try to stay with us as much as possible, but I'm going to dump a lot on you. The second warning is the lesson is going to be a little depressing, because the title of the lesson is Questions of Accusation. And what I mean by that, we're going to be looking tonight at the people that interacted with Jesus and accused him, challenged him, expressed their unbelief in him, blasphemed against him. And the reason I've got a lot to throw at you tonight is there's so much of that in the Gospels. This is going to be the lesson that I'm going to share the most with you in terms of Scripture, and we're not going to read all. We don't have time, but I'll certainly be mentioning passages. And so maybe you can follow up on that later. But the sad reality is there's so much negative in the Gospels as people encountered the Son of God. They had this opportunity that you and I probably would cherish if we could have it. They had an opportunity to be face to face with God in the flesh. And so often they turned it into a contest or an attack. And in fact, I would say most of the Gospels are telling us of these kinds of encounters, rather than the ones where people understood who Jesus was and appreciated him and said, "Tell me more, tell me more." Those are the minority interactions with the Lord. So we can begin in John 1. And I think this is the greatest anomaly in all of human history. And I don't think that's overstating. John chapter 1 and verse 10. John comments on, in reflection on Jesus coming into the world. This is the Apostle John, who is spoken of in this gospel as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He had a special relationship with the Lord. Jesus, dying on the cross, entrusts his mother to John's care. So John's reflecting on the experience that he had had as being one of the Lord's inner circle. Not just an apostle, but Peter, James, and John were extra close to the Lord. And so John says this in verse 10 of chapter 1. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. This is how John's gospel begins. And the anomaly is the Creator comes into his own creation, and not merely the physical planet, which Jesus was the instrument of creation. Not only is it that, but when John says he came to his own people. As Jesus said to a woman on one occasion, "I did not come but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." That nation that had been prepared for his coming, going all the way back to Abraham specifically and the promises God made with Abraham. But all of that history from about 2000 BC and all the history with Moses as the lawgiver and the setting aside of those people specifically under the Old Testament covenant. The prophets that were sent to them. John the Baptist coming to make straight the paths for the Lord. Jesus came after all of that preparation, and it says the world did not know him and his own did not receive him. Jesus came on a mission to save, to reveal God in human packaging, if you will, to embody grace and love and truth and blessing to mankind, but he was hated and rejected for it. And let me ask you this question. If Jesus in the flesh was rejected, do you think that it will be any better in the world today, 2,000 years later, when people today encounter him? Not as they did 2,000 years ago in the flesh, but certainly by the testimony of John and others in the New Testament that knew Jesus personally. Jesus was in the flesh working miracles and directly teaching people from the divine mind. Now, Jesus commonly said, "I'm not speaking my own words, but the words of the Father." He defers to the Father, and in so doing, I think, sets an example for us. We speak the words of God to other people. And Jesus said, "I've come to speak the words of my Father, which becomes a hang-up for his opponents. But let me say this at the outset, sort of in contrast to the bad news that we've got coming in this lesson. The truth about Jesus' identity holds up to scrutiny. And I hope we can get that point across sort of in a negative way by looking at those that challenged him and the circumstances in which they did. I want us tonight not to walk away depressed. I want us to walk away with an assurance that God has provided evidence for us as to who Jesus really was and what his nature was and is, and what a relationship we can have with him based on the reasonable conclusion that God was with us. Emmanuel, God with us, in the person of Jesus Christ. The truth about Jesus' identity holds up to the doubts of skeptics, the denials of humanists, and the vitriol of hedonists who don't want anyone telling them how to live. Now, the fact that the evidence, I think, supports who Jesus really was and that he truly was the Son of God with us, that doesn't mean everybody's going to be convinced by the evidence. The evidence is there, and the evidence is conclusive. But it's also going to take a certain kind of heart to see it and to accept it. And so, on the one hand, I think an objective study of evidences is good and profitable, and we need to understand those things living in a world of skepticism and unbelief. But it also takes the right heart or the right attitude, a receptive attitude, or the evidence just is going to bounce off. Again, Jesus worked miracles in front of people who then made all kinds of accusations against him to escape the force of the authority that he was showing. Okay, so with that in mind, let's jump in. Jewish history records numerous messengers that have been sent by God over time to people in the world. So, for example, we've talked about Moses a little bit already in this series. He was the liberator of the people from Egyptian bondage, and he was the lawgiver. He was the mediator going up on Mount Sinai and receiving the law. The people were so frightened at this manifestation of God and his power and his presence, they said, tell him not to say anything anymore to us. We're not going to be able to survive it. You go talk to him and come down and tell us what he wants us to know. And so God did. God interacted with the people through Moses, and they directly got his will that we know as the law of Moses, but it originates with God. God sometimes sent prophets. We've mentioned some of those already in the series this week. Elijah and Jeremiah. In fact, some people, when Jesus questioned the disciples, who do men say that I am? They thought he was one of the Old Testament prophets resurrected. So they were thinking sort of in the right direction, but they were erroneous in the conclusions that they were drawing. And even angels were sent by God from time to time to communicate with mankind. Sometimes God spoke directly from heaven. We see examples of that in the Old Testament. But the idea of God coming to earth in the form of a man, and not merely in the appearance of a man, but truly in a body of flesh. So not an apparition, not a ghost, not a non-corporeal projection of some kind. The idea of God coming to mankind as a man was foreign to Jewish expectation. There was an expectation of the Messiah or the Anointed One coming, but it wasn't like Jesus. It wasn't a man. And this is, in part, is why the Jewish leadership, in part, it's not the whole explanation, why they struggled to recognize Jesus and accept him for who he was identifying himself to be. And this is why there is such confusion and opposition when Jesus begins to identify himself with the Father. I and the Father are one. I have come to do the Father's will. The words that I speak to you are not mine, but the Father's who sent me. Statements like that. What the Jews did understand, which might not translate to us in English, What the Jews understood in that kind of language was Jesus was identifying himself with the Father. Not merely an angel sent, not merely a prophet sent, not merely a lawgiver sent. But when Jesus talked about the Father, they knew what he meant. In fact, in one case in the Gospel of John, that's exactly what they say to him. You're making God out to be your Father. And for that, we accuse you of blasphemy. So turn with me to John 8. We can illustrate this in many ways, but again, we don't have all night. So we're going to have to pare this down a little bit. So let's just go to John 8. That'll suffice for our purposes tonight. So in John chapter 8, this is an example of the kind of interchange, the resistance that Jesus faced when he was here doing the work that the Father had given him to do. In verses 18 and 19 of John 8, I am one who bears witness of myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness of me. Here's the question. Remember, this series is about questions people ask Jesus. Verse 19, they said to him, where is your Father? Jesus answered, you know neither me nor my Father. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. Again, Jesus is speaking in terms of unity or oneness with the Father. And he's giving ample explanation and evidence for being one with the Father, but it isn't being heard. And the reason is, as Jesus tells the Jews on more than one occasion, you're of your father, the devil. Your orientation is not toward God. If you love me, if you love the Father, you'd love me. I've been sent by the Father. And so their orientation is askew. And they've let Satan into their hearts. And so when Jesus speaks, when he acts, when he works miracles, they're not seeing clearly. Down in verses 24 and 25 of John 8. Therefore I said to you that you will die in your sins. For if you do not believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. And they said to him, who are you? And Jesus said to them just what I have been saying to you from the beginning. He's going to be questioned like this all the way to his death. Who are you? Who do you make yourself out to be? Who do you claim to be? And already at this point in Jesus' ministry, he's saying, I'm exactly who I've been saying I am. But then when you run out of arguments, you start using ad hominem attacks. Ad hominem means against the man. So instead of answering an argument, you just attack the person who's opposing you. So go down to verse 48. This is after Jesus, in verses 37 and following, he just scorches them in this particular section. This is where he actually says, you are of your father the devil, in verse 44. The desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there's no truth in him. Remember what we're saying? What is our quest for? Truth. You ain't going to find it through the devil. His nature is a lie. It's everything opposed to God who is truth. And that's what Jesus tells them. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. Let me tell you, Jesus was a lot more blunt than people today think who don't really read the Bible. They think Jesus was just a pushover or a milquetoast, namby-pamby, he couldn't hurt a fly. What did I say last night? If you don't want the truth, don't ask Jesus, because he's going to give it to you. And sometimes it's very unvarnished. You are of your father the devil. That's pretty unvarnished. How do they respond? Verse 48, then the Jews answered and said to him, do we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Yeah. When you don't have any more answers, you just start calling names, right? You're a Samaritan. Remember the Samaritans were a hated group of people by the Jews, going all the way back to when the Assyrians brought settlers into the land, and they intermarried with some of the Jewish residue that was left there, and they became a hybrid people, both religiously and in heredity. So the Jews hated them. So when they say to Jesus, you are a Samaritan and have a demon, that's about as strong an accusation as you could muster. But again, what do people do in situations like this? They accuse other people of what they are guilty of. Jesus said, no, you're the ones that are of the devil. And they turned around, oh, you have a demon. Also in John chapter 8, in verse 53, as Jesus interacts with them some more, this is what they ask. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who is dead? And the prophets are dead. Who do you make yourself out to be? Again, Jesus was giving plenty of information and evidence for them to answer these questions, but they simply aren't letting their mind go there. In verse 57, then the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? And of course, Jesus famously responds in verse 58, most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. What's their response to that? They took up stones to kill him. They ran out of arguments. They couldn't answer what Jesus was saying, so violence is the only option that they've got, they think, at this point in time. And so when Jesus is presenting himself in truth as being God among them, God with them, Emmanuel, what's their reaction? Pushback. They're not accepting this, in spite of the evidence that's being offered. Now, to be fair, go back to Matthew chapter 8. There were times when Jesus' own disciples struggled with this. And so in Matthew chapter 8, we find in verses 23 through 27 an incident where the disciples are in a boat with Jesus on the Sea of Galilee, and we're told in verse 24, a tempest arises on the sea, the boat being covered with the waves, and Jesus is sleeping. And all of this maelstrom is going on around them, and the disciples are afraid. They think the boat's going to sink, and several of them were fishermen. They sort of knew when they were in trouble on the Sea of Galilee, and they were in trouble. And they cry out to him in verse 25, Lord, save us, we are perishing. But he said to them, why are you fearful, O you of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. That's not something you see every day. In the midst of a raging storm, Jesus simply speaks, and nature obeys. What did we read a minute ago in John 1? He came into his own. Jesus was the creator of the world, and he demonstrates this authority. And then what did the disciples ask? And the men marveled, saying, who can this be, that even the winds and the sea obey him? What's the difference between the disciples and the Jewish leadership? They're both struggling with this question of who Jesus is, with his deity. The difference is the disciples are willing to pursue with an open mind, even sometimes against natural inclinations. But they're willing to pursue with an open mind the answer to that question. The Jewish leadership wouldn't do that. They were concerned about their power structure. They were concerned about hanging on to their positions. Their minds were steeped in rabbinic tradition instead of what the Old Testament actually taught. And so they were so blinded by their traditions and by their erroneous preconceptions that when Jesus was presenting himself in truth, they just simply couldn't go there. But the disciples would. They were slow on the uptake, but they were honest. And they remained with Jesus. And they would often come to Jesus and question. And we'll be talking about some of that tomorrow. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 16, when Jesus does ask this question, who do men say that I am? Because there's a lot of speculation going on. There's a lot of rumors circulating. Jesus has certainly made a splash and made an impression, but people don't know what to make of it. Matthew 16 and verse 13, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? Verse 14, so they said, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But who do you say that I am? Now we got the reversal, right? Jesus is asking them questions. Who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You kind of want to give Peter a hand on that one, don't you? Because so often he answered wrong. But he got that one. He got that one. He's learning. The disciples are learning. Are they there yet? Absolutely not. They're really not going to be there till after the resurrection. I mean, fully grasping and understanding who Jesus is. But they're willing to keep going with him when they don't have all of their questions answered. Not yet, anyway. And I'll be brief through this section, but I'm trying to overwhelm you with information that's negative, it's bad, because I want you to see what Jesus faced when he came into the world to display God. What he got was hatred and rejection. So at Jesus' trial, again, I'll be brief through these. Jesus' trial is when the attacking questions reach their awful climax. Caiaphas in Matthew 26 and verse 62, when they're questioning Jesus and he knows this is a mockery of justice, and he won't even answer them. He wouldn't dignify the proceedings with an answer. And Caiaphas, the acting high priest at the time, said, do you answer nothing? What is this that these men testify against you? Oh, you mean those false witnesses that can't even get their story straight? No, I'm not even responding to that. Jesus wouldn't even answer. And so here's Caiaphas on his high horse, daring Jesus with this question. Do you answer nothing? I mean, the restraint and the patience of Jesus at this moment is almost unfathomable. Someone who had the power to strike Caiaphas dead on the spot, and he restrains himself. Then in Matthew 26 and verse 63, Caiaphas says, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. That's more a dare than a question. I dare you to admit that you're the Son of God before this august body. An officer of the court in John chapter 18 and verse 22, after Jesus tells Caiaphas to question his hearer, why are you asking me? Ask the people that heard me what I've been teaching and what I've been saying. We're told in John 18:22 that a guard struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? Again, it kind of makes you want to duck. You know, lightning's going to about strike here. You have stricken the Son of God, and not with a closed fist, a slap, an insult. And Jesus took it. I mean, he responded. You know, if I'm guilty of something, then state the guilt. But if I'm not, then why did you strike me? Complete control of himself. Complete control of his emotions. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 68, after he was stricken that first time, then other officers of the Jewish high court struck him and said, prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you? This is the Son of God, the Creator, who came to his own, and his own are not receiving him. In fact, they're humiliating him, shaming him, daring him. Then in Matthew 27 and verse 11, Jesus is now before Pilate, the period of his trial that goes before the Roman authorities. And Pilate, as you know, I'm sure from your studies, he's convinced Jesus is innocent. He's not guilty of anything. He says this 4 or 5 different times in the course of the trial. There's one point in the trial, though, that Matthew in Matthew 27, verse 11, records for us. And this is when Pilate has almost won the day, but the Jews come back to him and say, we have a law that such a one should die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. And Pilate, I'm assuming, is at least superstitious enough. You know, his wife had a dream and sent a message to him during the trial, have nothing to do with that righteous man. And superstition among the people of that day was not unusual. But at that time, Pilate comes back in to confront Jesus and ask Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Matthew 27 and verse 13, again, Pilate says to Jesus, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" Again, Jesus was silent. He was not replying to Pilate because he knew it wasn't going to do any good. He knew they had Pilate's number. They knew how to manipulate Pilate. Even though Pilate was the supreme Roman ruler of the land, he knew that the Jews could send a delegation to Rome and file complaints against him. And in fact, they eventually did after the New Testament recording of this is over. But to rule over these people was precarious. They were a volatile people. They were difficult to govern. Pilate knew that, and they knew that. And that was the leverage that they needed to actually get Jesus crucified at the hands of Pilate, though Pilate is saying he's innocent. But Pilate is saying here to Jesus, "Do you not hear?" Of course he heard. Do you not hear what they're saying about you? And then in Luke 23, verses 8 and 9, Jesus is taken before Herod because Pilate's wanting to get rid of the whole thing. He doesn't want to have to deal with Jesus. He knows he's an innocent man. But because of the Passover, Herod, who actually had Jewish control of Galilee, is in the city for the Passover. And so Pilate sends Jesus over to Herod, hoping he can wash his hands of the whole matter and let Herod figure all this out. So Luke 23, verses 8 and 9, it says that Herod had heard many things about Jesus, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. And then Luke says he questioned him with many words. But he answered him nothing. Jesus didn't feel compelled to even answer these questions because they did not come from an honest place. This was a dog and pony show. Herod wanted to see a miracle. Herod wanted to see Jesus perform. Come on, do something for us. We hear you're a great miracle worker. And whatever else Herod was asking, Luke just says he questioned him with many words. None of the questions were legitimate. They didn't come from an honest place. And so Jesus remained silent. That is just a sampling of the kinds of questions that men asked Jesus when they had an agenda of unbelief. And on the very issue that is the most important, the most vital, his deity. They could not expand their minds broadly enough to accept the evidence that he was presenting, that he was not merely a man, he was a man, not merely a man, and did share the divine nature with the Father. Again, that's not what the Jews were expecting, and they couldn't open their minds to the evidence. A whole lot more to say on that, but we're going to move along. The second set of questions that we get in opposition to Jesus are the attacks on his practices. Let's go to Matthew chapter 12. So it's not just Jesus' words. It's not just what he claims. Sorry, Matthew 15. It's what Jesus is actually doing that is brought into question. In this case, more particularly what his disciples were doing. But Matthew chapter 15, let's just read a few verses here. Beginning in verse 1, "Then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus, saying, 'Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread.' But he answered and said to them, 'Why do you also transgress the commandment of God? Because of your traditions. For God commanded, saying, Honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, Whoever says to his father or mother, Whatever profit you might have received from me has been dedicated to the temple, is released from honoring his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites. Well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" This criticism, again, is based, as Jesus says, is based on rabbinic tradition, not on Scripture. And by the time of Jesus, that rabbinic tradition had replaced, for all practical purposes, the law. They would read out of the law in their synagogues, but what took precedent was the traditions of the rabbis handed down orally. They've not been written down yet at this point. But you notice when the question is asked, and it's all based on tradition, Jesus just goes on the attack. He turns the matter right around against them. He doesn't even bother to deal with the question of eating without washing their hands, this elaborate ritual they would go through when they had been out in public, out in the marketplace, and they would come in to eat, and then they would have to wash the pollution of the Gentiles off of them, as it were. Jesus just ignores that. And he turns around and tries to, like we said, he will hone in on the exact issue that needs to be addressed. And in this case, it's the fact that their question comes from complete hypocrisy. The Jews had created loopholes in the law. In this case, escaping the responsibility of caring for your parents in their later years because you can just say, I gave it the office already. I've dedicated this to the temple. It is Corban. I'm not responsible for my parents anymore. And so in the stinging rebuke, Jesus applies Isaiah's condemnation to his generation 700 years before. But it's being played out again in the current generation that will not acknowledge who Jesus really is. And so he talks about them drawing near with their mouth and honoring with their lips, but their heart is far from me, God had said through Isaiah. And they're worshiping him in vain. And so this is one example. There's another, actually in the Gospels, there are 6 examples of Jesus supposedly, in their minds, the Jewish minds, violating the Sabbath day. This actually was maybe the main sticking point between Jesus and the Pharisees. And it's one in which Jesus seems to deliberately tweak them. He seeks out opportunities to do things on the Sabbath day that do not violate the letter of the law on the Sabbath, but they do violate the tradition of the Pharisees that they had made up in their own minds. And so there are several of these. And by the way, if anyone wants any of these notes that we're going through this week, I'll be happy to supply them to you. But I have in the notes here, I'll not review them now, but those 6 examples of Sabbath controversies. But let's look at one, and that's in John chapter 9. John chapter 9. This is where Jesus heals a man who has been blind from birth, and then that man has a clash with the Pharisees because this healing had occurred on a Sabbath day. And so, for example, we're not going to read through all of this context, but go down to verse 16 of John chapter 9. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, speaking of Jesus in regard to the blind man. They asked him in verse 15 how he'd received a sight, and he explains what Jesus had done. Their response, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can such a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. Legitimate question. How does a man work miracles if he is in violation of the law of God? This is what the miracles were designed to do. They were not an end in and of themselves to relieve all of the ailments and problems and difficulties of mankind. They were miraculous events that, for the most part, did have the blessing of mankind being exhibited in a miraculous fashion. But really what they were intended to do was prove the authority of Jesus to say what he was saying. That if you struggled with what he said, you could at least point to what he did. Isn't that what Nicodemus said? We know that you're a teacher come from God for what? No man can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. The same thing is being said here, but the Jewish leadership they're just not going to have it. They're so stuck on the Sabbath day as a tradition, and they'd built layer after layer after layer of requirements and restrictions on the Sabbath day. They had left the original intent of the Sabbath far behind. And they've blinded themselves to their tradition to the point that when Jesus is demonstrating miracles on the Sabbath day, no work done, no stress or strain on his part, that's what they see and not the miracle. In verse 17, they said to the blind man again, "What do you say about him because he opened your eyes?" He said, "He is a prophet." Now, that's an honest and, it is an accurate remark. Jesus is a prophet. He's more than that, but he is a prophet. But the man himself is drawing the right conclusion, having had almost zero interaction with Jesus other than the healing. Then they're not satisfied. The leadership, in verse 19, they bring the man's parents in, and they start questioning them, and they're afraid. Because it's clear by now in John 9, it's clear that anyone who advocates for Jesus, acknowledges him in any sense, you're in trouble with the Sanhedrin. And so they kind of take a pass. We know he was born blind, but how he got his sight, you ask him. So in verses 24 and following, they again call the man who was blind and said to him, "Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered and said, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see." Then they said to him again, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I told you already, and you do not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him and said, "You are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from." How did they know God had spoken to Moses? You remember Moses was concerned about that at the burning bush. You want me to go where? You want me to do what? How am I supposed to convince these people? And God gave him signs to work in front of the people, to convince the people that he had divine authority. In other words, Jesus is doing the same thing that Moses did, and they gain respect for Moses, even to this generation, but they're rejecting Jesus on the same principle that Moses received his authority to speak on. So again, they're inconsistent at best and just being hypocritical at worst. So these are, again, attacks. Now, this that we're looking at here is not specifically directed to Jesus, but it's indirectly being expressed to Jesus. They are showing their true heart, their true colors, by attacking the very man that had been healed. I mean, no compassion for him, no concern for his improvement in his human welfare. All they can see is they've got to do something about Jesus. The third topic that we'll look at, and then we'll close our thoughts tonight. Questions that are insincere or lying or entrapping questions. There are so many examples of these where people came to Jesus thinking they were going to get the best of him. They were going to put him in some kind of a conundrum that he couldn't get out of, put him in a dilemma that he would incriminate himself, whatever he said. This is just sad that men thought they could outwit the Creator. And he's giving them evidence of who he is. They don't see that. They could have if they had had a different heart. But there are many of them, and I'm going to list through these very quickly for the sake of time. In Matthew 17 and verse 24, does your teacher not pay the temple tax? You remember, they asked that of Peter. And again, bless his heart, Peter doesn't answer correctly. Yeah. My master he'll pay the temple tax. You remember what happened when he went in, Jesus said, "Peter, Does the king receive taxes from his own son? But lest we offend them. Go down to the water, the first fish you pull up, there'll be 2 coins in its mouth, one for me and one for you, and go pay the temple tax. See, Peter was still not getting it. But it's the question, does your teacher not pay the temple? They're looking for anything they can find to accuse him. Again, we read already in John 8, but then back in John 7, even before that, the Pharisees said to Jesus, "You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you?" Jesus had asked them, why are you seeking to kill me? You have a demon. Who's seeking to kill you? That's just a flat lie. Who is seeking to kill you? Well, you are. John chapter 6 and verse 30, "What sign will you perform then that we may see it and believe you?" Trivia here. You remember who said that? Who asked that question? Some of the very same people that the day before were in the crowd of the 5,000 that he fed with an insufficient amount of food. And what are they asking now? What sign are you going to perform that we may see it and believe? Really? They not only saw a miracle, they benefited from it the day before. And yet, it's insufficient for them. John 8 and verse 5, "This woman was caught in adultery in the very act." But what do you say? They had trumped this whole thing up. It was completely bogus. They knew what the law taught. If it were true what they said, this woman was caught in the act of adultery, where was the man? Again, it was a setup. In Matthew chapter 22, beginning in verse 15, the Pharisees plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. And then he was asked by a lawyer, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God in truth." That was fluff. "Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Matthew 22, verses 15 through 17. Setting him up to ask a question that they thought would cause him to be on the horns of a dilemma one way or the other, however he answered that. Of course, Jesus is never on the horns of a dilemma. But in the next verse, it says Jesus perceived their wickedness. In Matthew 22, let's turn to that passage. Matthew chapter 22. This is where the lawyer comes to Jesus with a loaded question designed again to get Jesus to contradict himself and be open to further accusations that would undermine his influence. You know this well. Matthew 22, verses 35 and 36. A lawyer came to Jesus asking a question, testing him. "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Jesus answers here, as we've already stated in this series, he drills down to the fundamental principle that needs to be dealt with. And I'm sure in that day there were lots of controversial discussions about which law was more important to keep than which other law, but that's not where Jesus goes in this answer. He goes to the very foundation of keeping the law of God in the first place, and that's the heart. It's the attitude. To love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Treat others with the highest regard, but that springs first from loving God. And of course, the lawyer even says in one of the other gospel accounts that he had answered well. Oh, actually, it's here in my notes. Mark 12, verses 32 and 34. "Well said, teacher. You have spoken the truth." And Jesus said, what? "You're not far from the kingdom." Who's not far from the kingdom? The one that listens to Jesus and says, "You've spoken the truth." Folks, that principle is not any different today. The people that are closest to the kingdom today are the people that have their ears and their minds open. And they hear Jesus. And they accept and appreciate the truth of who he is and what he's expecting of them and what he's done for them. Those are the people not far from the kingdom. So let me make a couple of observations and then we'll close the lesson. I've heard this statement. I know what we mean by it. I don't want to be overly critical. But I hear this statement made sometimes. There's no such thing as a stupid question. I beg to differ. There are stupid questions. And we've just been thinking about a lot of them tonight. There are questions that are born of wickedness. There are questions that are born of unremediable skepticism. Questions that are born of insincerity. Questions to make a point. Questions to ignore the truth. Questions that show you haven't been listening. We Bible class teachers get that sometimes. We've said in this series that God is open to sincere questions. And we've had examples of that going all the way back to the first evening. But we better make sure that our questions about God and to God are coming from the right place. And so in regard to our questions or the questions somebody else may ask us with this mindset of insincerity or agnosticism or daring us on some level, let me just give 3 suggestions. Number 1, beware of yes-no questions. Truth is often, as we've been saying, complex and cannot be answered by one word. Don't let people push you into that corner. If people are really searching for the truth, they should be willing to give you the opportunity to expound upon your answer. And just because they want to force you into a yes-no doesn't mean you have to answer. And I'll tell you, that's our conscience works against us in this kind of an occasion. Because we feel like if I've been asked something, I'm just bound to answer it. Was Jesus? Did Jesus always answer? I mean, we've looked at several examples tonight where he didn't. Because the questions weren't born of honesty. Secondly, related to that one, beware of false dilemmas. It's kind of like a yes-no, but people sometimes will say, what do you think, A or B? And they're expecting you to choose A or B. The truth is often C or D. Don't let people do that to you. Depends on who's asking the question, but again, if they're honest, they should be willing to let you answer the question as seems best to you and not choose a pre-selected answer that they're giving you. And then thirdly, beware of questions that are asked only for debate and there's no real desire to find the truth. We may need to respond to those, at least in a cursory way, to give some kind of an answer, but we need to beware of the heart that is resistant and it really is not asking for information. They're asking to gain an advantage. That happened to Jesus all the time. Again, most of what questions were asked of Jesus or his disciples in the Gospels are negative. They have an ulterior motive to them. We talked tonight about questions regarding Jesus' practices. And again, we said often these were produced by their own wayward thinking about things, their traditions that had confused them on what the Old Testament actually was teaching. But here's a question Jesus, turn to John chapter 8. Here's a question Jesus asks his opponents. John chapter 8 and verse 46. We had read from this chapter earlier, we did not read this verse. Which of you convicts me of sin? And if I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Folks, that's a contemporary question. That's a question for today. If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Jesus here is pointing out, I think, the lack of substance of his critics and what they're saying about him, what they're accusing him of. And Jesus affirms, I'm telling you the truth. I presented the truth. I presented the evidence of God for what I'm saying, the miracles. I'm fulfilling prophecy, which will become even more evident at his death. Why do you not believe me? It isn't a question of the amount of information. It's the heart that is resistant. Being innocent of wrongdoing, that is Jesus, does not stop evil. His opponents will forge ahead with false accusations, baseless charges, in order to create leverage, diminish their opponents, push Pilate into a corner, and ultimately get what they wanted. And that's the crucifixion of Jesus. Completely ignorant of the fact that that was prophesied. And it had to be in order for salvation and redemption to be provided. All of this opposition to Jesus that we read about in the Gospels did not work. It did not achieve their goals because Jesus' behavior was godly, it was consistent, he was faultless, he was motivated by love, which caused him to call them out. Love does not remain silent when someone needs correction. And Jesus corrected, and he did it with concern for their spiritual welfare. Sometimes that meant exposing their hypocrisy and their wicked intent. And then finally, regarding Jesus' deity, which we talked about first tonight, there are people today, even so-called Christian groups today, that do not believe that Jesus was actually a divine being. By contrast, who said this? What have we to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time? Matthew 8, verse 29, demons knew who Jesus was. They have more insight than a lot of people today who deny that Jesus is the Son of God. And so let me wrap this up just simply by saying this as a general principle. The problem that we're talking about tonight, the challenge that Jesus faced when he was here on the earth, is not created by a lack of evidence. If somebody today says, well, if God would just show himself to me, as we said earlier, if Jesus would just speak to me, they're not saying that out of a lack of evidence. They're saying it out of a wayward heart. It's a lack of openness to the evidence that's already been given. And let me say this. Jesus and his divine nature and the nature of his death and the purpose of that death, that can stand up to any scrutiny. I don't care if it's Richard Dawkins, who we mentioned last night. I don't care what, atheist, what humanistic biologist, what philosopher. I don't care who it is. And brethren, I want us to leave here tonight with this confidence. God Almighty and his Son, Jesus Christ, can stand up to man's criticisms, man's doubts. And I want you that are younger in the audience tonight to think about this. Don't let anybody cow you. Don't let anybody intimidate you. They do not have the high moral or intellectual ground. Jesus does. You cannot take that to the bank. You can take that to heaven. You can base your eternal welfare, your eternal future on the truth that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Even demons said it. Even demons believe and tremble. James chapter 2. They have a heart problem. They won't submit to who they believe in, and that's possible. We're very complicated beings, whether demons or humans. We don't always live according to what we say we know. Demons know who Jesus is, but they don't submit to him. That's frightening, isn't it? Beings that were in the presence of God choose not to submit to him. I know that probably raises lots of questions in our minds, but whatever the answers are, it's frightening. It's frightening. So tonight we will ask, have you resisted God? You remember what Jesus called his generation when they kept asking for signs? An evil and an adulterous generation asked for signs. I've given you the signs. I've given you the evidence. You're not hearing. You're not seeing. But is there a question in your mind that causes you to pull back, that causes you to doubt, causes you to withdraw, or remain in an agnostic frame of mind? I would dare say it's not because you've lacked evidence. I think you probably need to look at your heart and ask yourself, even if you got the right answer, would you be willing to accept it? Because that's what we're talking about in the Gospels. We're talking about people that had plenty of answers and plenty of evidence. They did not have an open heart to it. And so are your questions that are holding you back the product of true spiritual curiosity? Or is it hostility and opposition because you don't want the answer that the Bible or Jesus is giving you? And so, as we said last night, we have to look inside our own hearts and our own minds and be honest, or we have no hope. I can say that without any caveat to it. If we are not honest with God, we have no hope. We've got to be open and honest with our Creator. Look, He already knows. You're not hiding anything from Him. He already knows. So really the challenge is for us to come to an understanding of ourselves and what attitude we have toward God, and whether that's an attitude of love and compliance and a desire for fellowship, or we've reached a comfortable place in our minds where we can be a skeptic or an agnostic and just not commit to anything. Well, you can. God will give you the ability to do that, but it's a hopeless frame of mind. So is there someone here that we can help tonight? That I hope something's been said if you're in this category of resisting God, that you'll see the folly of that in what we've said tonight, in those that resisted Jesus even to the point of killing him. But you know what? Even those people that did that on the day of Pentecost when Peter preached, they were in that audience, and some of them were ones that responded to the gospel. Peter calls them out in Acts 2. He calls them out. You're responsible for this. But at the end of his evidence that he presented after Jesus was raised, you know what they asked Peter? Men and brethren, what shall we do? I think another way you can look at that question is there anything we can do? I think at that point they thought they were dead men. We killed the Son of God. Is there anything we can do? If you're here tonight and you're not in a relationship with God, there is something you can do. You can do whatever it is that you haven't done that God has made plain. But it begins with believing that Jesus is God's Son. And then that's followed by living a life that confesses Him by the mouth, by the way that we live, by the decisions that we make. Being penitent in mind, turning away from sin, turning away from our rebellion toward God, and living in concert with Him. And then finally being immersed in water to say in action to ourselves and to others, yes, I believe Jesus is the Son of God and He is my hope. And I submit to that hope, acknowledging His death, burial, and resurrection in this that I am now doing, to be buried in water, raised to walk in newness of life. And from that point on, committing your life to Him because of what He has done for you. Can we help you while we stand and sing?